Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. We got questions across all platforms this time, so let's just jump right in and start with YouTube. First up, Scotter140 wanted to know, when they ask a question on YouTube, can they just put it in the regular comments, or do they have to navigate to a different page? Well, there's two answers to that. If specifically you're talking about these weekly Q&As, please post any question you have wherever you support in the latest support post. The way these work, I can't go back to different posts, and all of the public comments are just public comments, so I won't be able to tell who's a supporter or not. And respectfully, while I always want to share everything I do with everybody, these Q&As are a thank you to everybody that supports. So I don't take public questions, although I probably should do some public live stream style stuff just for fun. Maybe I should do that every couple of months or every month or something, but it's hard to find the time for anything extra these days. But if you're specifically talking about the Q&A stuff, then yes, please ask in the Q&A posts, not in the regular comments. But I do read pretty much every comment on all of the videos. But I do that through the YouTube Creators Comments app, page, whatever you want to call it. So I see all the new comments that go through, but I don't always see responses to stuff. It's kind of weird using that. So, I really probably spend an unhealthy amount of time going through YouTube comments just because there's a lot of great conversations. There's a lot of questions that I think I could help out with. I just don't for the Q&A videos. I sometimes do in case I made a mistake. I want to pin a comment. Occasionally somebody posts something really funny, whatever. But I don't generally interact with those as much just because it's really a supporter thing. So, I don't mean any disrespect to anybody by saying that. I know that always upsets people when I explain how these work, or upsets some people, not everybody, but it is what it is. I'm just trying to do something nice for everybody that's supporting and keeping all of these videos and all of the crazy research and products alive. So thanks to all of you. And Scotter140, any questions you have, right where you posted, if your support on YouTube is totally fine. And for anybody on Floatplane and Patreon, just post in theirs. And if anybody knows of other support services that they want me to be on, let me know, because I want to sign up for whatever's easiest for everybody else. I don't really, as long as it's something that's really worth everybody's time. Like, I was on a few other support services in the past. One of them nobody used, and the other one I think only 2 people used. So, I want to do stuff that I just want to make it easier on people who want to support but might not be part of the other platforms. So if you have anything else that you suggest, please let me know. But for now, it's just the YouTube join function, Floatplane, and Patreon. Over on Floatplane, BroVideo wanted to know if I was aware of any work towards a traditional optical drive emulator for the Sega CD. The Mega SD and Mega EverDrive Pro are fantastic, but they love having their entire Model 2 Tower of Power connected in all its glory. It's a shame that I have to disconnect my Sega CD just to use current ODEs, not to mention the fact that I have to remove my 32X as well. What a bummer. I hope someday we see a solution closer to the X-Station or mode for the Sega CD. Great points. I don't know of anybody, but I do think it's something that people should work on, because the fact is there's just so many dead Sega CDs out there that an ODE would totally fix. Maybe it just needs a recap, but the whole laser assembly is dead or something like that. So I think it's something that people do want. I just don't think it's something people wanted as much as the Mega SD or Mega EverDrive Pro. So it probably got pushed back a little bit, but I really do hope to see something like that, because I do also like the look of everything as well. And who knows, maybe there's other creative ways to get around that. I do know that the Mega EverDrive Pro has an option to turn off all warnings, so you can use it with the Sega CD connected. It sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't, and it might have a bus conflict issue, which may or may not harm some of the hardware. It's unlikely, but it's just one of those things where Crix put up the warning and the option just for people that want to try it, but with the very, open and honest statement of, hey, this may or may not work. Try it if you will. So, that is something you could consider, but you're right. The 32X would always have an issue for certain things, but you'd always have to remove the 32X for Master System games anyway, so that's kind of something that people who like the Tower of Power are probably already used to. But sorry, the answer is just a no at the moment, but it is something that I hope to see. Over on Patreon, Kevin Hine wants to know if I've checked out the unamplified version of the Otaku 6-port automatic SCART switch. They've gotten so used to the auto-switching convenience of the G-SCARTs, but can't justify the extra expense this year. I have not, and my guess, just a guess here, is that because it doesn't have the sync circuit built in and it's just a switch, there wouldn't be any voltage issues, but you would still have the same, make very sure not to turn on more than one console at the same time. You might have that issue with the PlayStation that I had on my model, but Ray didn't have on his, so it might not even be an issue anyway. The only thing is, if you're using this in a scenario where, like, you bought, a brand new G-SCART within the past year or so it has all the sync regeneration and the automatic switching, all those awesome features, and you just want to add more consoles to that, I think the cheaper one might actually be a great scenario. So you run, try to run everything that needs special kind of sync treatment through the G-SCART, put everything else in the Otaku, and link those together with a 1-foot SCART cable, and there you go. Now you have a 15-port SCART switch with all the advantages of the sync regeneration. I would think that in that scenario that it would actually work pretty well, but without testing it, I got to give the disclaimer of, there's no way to tell unless you put it on a scope and test it. However, if you live in the US and you want to ship me one, I'll gladly test it for you and do a very quick little write-up on it or something. That's no problem at all. Even if you live outside the US, that's fine, but shipping is a lot of money these days. So, I don't want to have you buy it, and then have me have to ship it to Australia or something like that. No disrespect, just saying. So the answer to your question is no, I haven't tested it, but if it should be safe in that scenario, but there's no way to be absolutely sure unless I throw it on a scope and test. So let me know if you end up picking one up. Kelv SYC wants to talk again about using USB-C to power retro consoles. Before I read your question, I just want to reiterate my opinion on this again, certainly not fact, just opinion, and that I think it might be a terrible idea because there's no telling what the original source would be. So yes, if you go out and get a really nice USB-C brick, it would be perfect, but what if you got one of those $2 ones from a gas station and tried to power a console off of it, which people are going to end up doing, even if it's by accident and they grab the wrong one. But anyway, let me read through your question and see, maybe I'm wrong before I even started. There are many products out there that take USB-C power, typically a MacBook charger, but any USB-C power brick will do, in order to charge a laptop that isn't powered by USB-C, which could be one that has a barrel jack, which in turn has led to anecdotes about soldering irons powered by USB-C. Not knowing too much about how it works, this Hackaday project seems to indicate that you could program a USB PD emulator in such a way to supply just the right power to a retro console, if you could provide the needed plugs on the console end. Since I'm not an electrical engineer, I'd like to know if you could use it to indeed power a retro console, and if so, how would it compare to the currently endorsed power solutions like the Triads? Okay, so good. I didn't stick my foot in my mouth when I answered before I read. All my thoughts I said earlier are the same, and while you can do stuff like this, it's generally just cheaper and way easier to get a bunch of Triads and the pigtails from Castlemania. It's the same. And my answer and my attitude towards this is the exact same as people that say, hey, can't I get one AC plug and use DC power distribution? And the answer is yes, if you go above and beyond to deal with all of the issues that would introduce, which at the end of the day would always cost more and be a lot more hassle than just picking up a bunch of Triads. So while you certainly could build a device like that, and you probably could even build logic in that the device won't power the console unless it detects the correct power signal coming into it, so that you couldn't use a cheap, low wattage, low amperage power supply. I'm pretty sure you could do that, but it's going to cost more and be much more of a pain than just picking up the Triads. So while I always love ideas like this that could potentially simplify people's setups, it's just everybody should be very nervous about messing with power on stuff, because even if something doesn't blow it out immediately, using the wrong kind of power supply or even just a very low quality one could significantly reduce the life of your console. I'm not talking about, oh, well, it was going to last 50 more years. Now it's going to last 49 years and 11 months. Like, I'm talking it could kill a console in a year or two if you use a bad power solution. So I'm always very, very careful about that. And while I keep these ideas coming, because there's always, even ideas where the answer turns out to be, this probably isn't the best idea, could always spark better ideas. So keep them coming, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it for retro stuff. Oliver Clare is trying to free up one of the two SCART ports on their main CRT and was wondering if a G-SCART switch would accept a component signal via something like RetroTink's comp to RGB and then output that signal to a CRT's SCART port. Yeah, that will work absolutely fine. Just one issue is that the comp to RGB is always outputting a signal, even if it's not receiving one. So what most people in this scenario do is get a USB cable with an inline power switch and only power on their comp to RGB when they're actually using it. So it takes away the fully automatic version of it. So, you technically can have a G comp switch plugged in through one of those into a G SCART switch. You would just have to flick the power on that. And I think some people had experimented with what port you put the SCART, the SCART output of the comp to RGB in. Because I think in some scenarios, if you power on a console that's a port ahead of that, it'll switch to it. But I think, that doesn't work as consistently. You really should only have one console powered on at a time anyway. So I would suggest just getting that set up and getting a USB cable with an inline switch, or just manually plugging it in. But as far as signal-wise, yeah, that'll work totally perfect. And thanks very much for the kind words. Tony had a recommendation based on the discussion from last week of Nintendo shutting down that tournament. Tony said, if you want to get a lawyer's perspective on game-related issues, I recommend listening to Virtual Legality by Hogue Law. Richard Hogue provides a great breakdown of arguments and the issues, the community reactions, and what he thinks could happen based on how the legal system works today. Check out his episode on the Big House to get an idea. And then Tony linked to a YouTube post that's 35 minutes long. That's very reasonable. That, I guess, is David Hogue's direct look on the shutdown of that Smash tournament. That's definitely something that would interest me. I'll have to wait till I'm in a good mood to listen to it, because these things tend to piss me off because, I think my incredibly pessimistic and negative view of the U.S. legal system is sadly accurate, in that in situations like this, whoever has the better lawyer and more money wins, or who at least could spin their version of the truth to be more charismatic than the other wins. It's gross. So sorry if any of you are lawyers and I'm pissing you off by talking this way. I know lawyers do a bunch of really amazing work, and I've worked with some great ones over the years in different companies that I've worked with, but in situations like this, I think my unfortunate view on it seems to be the most accurate. But if there's a day that I'm working on a project and I want to have something to listen to, I'll definitely throw that on. So thanks for the recommendation. Frank says they're getting a shiny new SNES flash cart next week, and they're wondering what some of my favorite SNES ROM hacks are, or just my favorite ROM hacks in general. If you're getting an FX Pack or FX Pack Pro or SD to SNES or SD to SNES Pro, whatever, any of those, I would highly recommend checking out the BS Zeldas. If you go way back in the roundups, I interviewed Khan, one of the people that worked on it, and I think the week before I discussed how you set them up. It is a little confusing because if you've played the BS Zelda hacks in the past, there's a slightly different way of transferring the save files over and all that. I really should revisit that, to be honest. Those games are amazing. Maybe when Mr. eventually adds MSU1 support, I'll go back and do a whole video about that just to celebrate it and everything. But yeah, if you're using one of the more advanced ROM carts, definitely check those out, because it's a weird experience that you're not going to be able to have any other way. But in general, my favorite ROM hacks are like quality of life ones. So ones that fix bugs, ones that, add features like in Zelda A Link to the Past, one of the quality of life updates is that you could turn while running, which is something you couldn't do in the original. And it's something that, arguably you're not playing the game the right way, but I think it makes it better. Little tiny things like that. And those are hacks that you could play on any ROM cart. And of course, any English translations of games that were native Japan games are always kind of neat too, because, those are stuff that I wouldn't be able to experience for the most part without it. So yeah, the quality of life stuff is definitely my favorites, as well as the MSU versions of the BS Zeldas, I think are absolutely excellent. So that's probably plenty to get you started. Just go to romhacking.net and search for any of those patches. And I don't know if the links, this is 4 or 5 years ago now, so I'm not sure if the links that I used to post to the BS Zelda stuff are still there, but it should be easily Googleable because they put an insane amount of work into that. So I can't imagine they would let that project fall off. Zagaz has a couple of questions. They have RGB modded most of their consoles and have one fighting them. They run a Hydra switch of the most recent variety, and it's worked very well combined with the OSSC. The top loader NES RGB is set up for TTL sync through a multi-out. They removed the RF shield and 3D printed a mount, and they use an Insurrection Industries SNES cable because they're convenient and very often in stock. Directly wired to the OSSC, they have no problem, but if they're going through the Hydra, they lose sync after 30 seconds. In my reading, I see that TTL from the NES RGB is not true TTL, and looking for input on the truth to that as well to see what they could do with their cables or board to stabilize the problem. I would check out the threads on Shmups about that. I think different revisions of the NES RGB had different fixes for that. I could be remembering that wrong, by the way. It's been a long time since I've messed with that. I think the last NES RGB installation I did was years ago, and any work I've been done recently, I usually would just ask Jose to do it for me because in case there's any problems, he'll be able to fix it. So I totally forgot, but I know there's definitely been some conversations about that. Very, very weird that the Hydra would have issues with that. I always tend to have issues every Hydra I've tested, so I don't know why that would happen. It shouldn't happen at all. Maybe if the Hydra has a sync toggle switch, check that out, but I don't know. That's kind of weird. Also, they have a core graphics too that they need to wire for RGB. They realize the SSD S3 from Terra Onion is amazing, but they don't want to fork over the money for it. They want to go the briefcase route and figured they would do the IFU RGB from Voltar. But they need the system region modded. Do you know a good source for the PCB to cut in or have a different recommendation for region modding since they want to collect TurboGrafx 16 titles? Oh man, it stumped me again. I don't know what the best solution for that would be. I think, I don't know what the best solution for that would be. I would look into region modding for core graphics and see who sells them. I vaguely remember GameTech selling something a long time ago that may have only been for the duos. But yeah, that's a great question, and I should know the answer to that. Sorry about that. Lastly, do you have any experience or knowledge about Cyclone component switches? They want something that matches the aesthetic of the rest of their home theater equipment. No, I've never used them. Sorry. I can't remember if I've even heard of them, but give it a try. If you have any issues with it, hopefully you could pick it up from a place that you could send it back. Also, thank you for your kind words. And how'd I do on the name pronunciation? Firebrand X wants to know if I could recommend screwdriver bits that don't easily strip, specifically Phillips head ones. So no, and if anybody listening could link to ones that they know are of good quality, please let me know. But the last time I had this discussion was a million years ago at the company where we manufactured or designed and manufactured computers. And I asked the same question because I kept stripping bits because, you're going through a ton of different screws. We had to line everything with metal braces because it was all for medical grade equipment. So it's all metal screws going into metal. So things would definitely strip easily. And one of the engineers got an expensive and really high quality set of screwdriver set. It was a German brand, and they were absolutely awesome, but they were so strong and so good that instead of stripping the Phillips head a little bit, it would actually snap the head of the screw off. if we didn't use like the best screws possible. So it was actually a double-edged sword, and it was almost better to use, not crappy screwdrivers, but just not super, super good, so that, if you started to see it strip a little bit, you would know, all right, hold on, am I over-tightening? Is it jammed? Whatever. So, that was also in a situation where we were constantly opening and closing stuff all day long. So I don't know if that would apply. Maybe for retro gaming too. It's this, over tightening with a really hardened screwdriver. I don't know. Maybe it would be better to get a smaller screwdriver. But that was just. Sorry, I don't know how well that applied to your question. I just brought back a memory of that. So because of that scenario, I don't really obsess over that. The only thing I do try to look at is getting a whole set of different screw bits that fit the different sizes of the Phillips head. So you're not trying to use a size that doesn't quite fit. That's really when I get a lot of issues. But that is a good question. I should have like a set of screwdrivers that are, in a drawer somewhere that are labeled like, caution or something, and that are meant to do things in scenarios which you need a strong screwdriver. In fact, there's a couple of things I have where the screws are stuck in them because none of the screwdrivers I have are hard enough to jam in there and brace it. So yeah, if anybody has good recommendations for that, please let me know. If by next week nobody does, I'll just email the old engineer I used to work with and get the name of those screwdrivers that wouldn't ever break. And, you could pick up a couple of those just for the scenarios, the exact weird scenarios that you described. Sean Kyosho Brown wanted to know if I knew of a lag-free HDMI to HDMI scaler, or if not lag-free, at least a low and consistent lag one. Their new 4K TV looks really soft with both 480p and 720p content, but looks fantastic at 480p and 4K. It's made the RetroTink 2X kind of hard to swallow, and they've built their entire setup around it. Plus, there's many 720p devices that also look like garbage now. So it's funny, I've never run into that with TVs, but I absolutely have with just basic computer monitors, where any resolution other than its native looks terrible. Most of the TVs I've tested have been pretty good overall, but I have heard other people with the same complaints as yours. And there is no good solution yet. The OSSC Pro, which is going to be very expensive, but that should have decent scaling in it, up to 1080p. And, there's a few other scalers being talked about that may, probably in the next few years that are going to be gaming related. But at the moment, the only thing that you could buy today that's cost effective that I know of is the DVDO iScan Micro, but I can't remember what the lag was on it. I had tested one years ago, and while it didn't, I think I tested it with the 240p test suite, and it was like a frame of lag or something. I honestly can't even remember, and there was 3 modes, and I don't know if I tested all 3 modes or anything like that. So $100 solution would be the DVDO iScan Micro, but you would definitely want to test that with a time sleuth just to make sure that it's not adding too much lag, and you'd want to test all 3 modes. So, if anybody has one that they want to send me, I could test it for them. But that's going to be like the cheapest solution at the moment. The other thing you could do is you could look into AVRs that have game mode in their signal processing chain, which I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I vaguely remember somebody mentioning to me once that they have an AVR. They tested it with a time sleuth, and it was like 6 frames of lag, but they set it to game mode, and it was much more reasonable, and it did an all right job. So those are going to be expensive, but if you were already looking to buy an AVR, that might be a solution, but you'd have to do some real searching to see which ones had game modes and to see if anybody's already lag tested them. And of course, I'd always recommend testing yourself after you get it. So, short-term solution, check out that iScan Micro. Maybe you could find one used, but try and confirm the lag on it. And once again, I'll gladly help if anybody has one to ship me. They're really small, so it should be a quick and cheap shipment. And look into AVRs, but for the most part, scalers that any future scalers that are gaming related would probably be a better solution, but those are most likely going to be expensive as well. So if you weren't planning on dropping a couple $100 on a solution, maybe just check out the Micro for now and make sure to lag test it. Lopo says they have a Japanese copy of Fire Emblem The Binding Blade for Game Boy Advance and wants to know if there's any kind of adapter where you could do a ROM hack to the original, just like Voltar has for NES or SNES games. And the answer is I don't know of anyone out there, but I think it's a really cool idea. And I definitely hope that somebody releases one of those. I love the thought of having an original game, but having a non-destructive way to update to do a ROM hack to it. And if you ever want to put it back, you could, if you want to leave it as is, fine. I think that's an awesome idea. I do think the space inside the Game Boy Advance cartridge would be an issue, though. So, to be honest, the only answer for the short term might be using a ROM cart version of it. So use a patched ROM on a ROM cart, which I know is not what you wanted to do. You wanted to use the original cart, which many people do, but I think with Game Boy Advance's case being so small, it might be kind of rough to do something like that. So, I think this is one of the advantages of having a ROM cart. And even if you're still a collector, I mean, nothing's going to change the fact that you have that awesome game, the original of it. But yeah, so sorry, I don't think that was the answer you're looking for, but I think it's the only way to do it. But anybody listening, please correct me if I'm wrong. If there really is a way to do some kind of hack to a Game Boy Advance ROM the same way Voltar does to NES and SNES games. Jonathan Levine said they read in various places that some Dreamcast games don't support RGB output when in 15 kHz mode, but they do support S-Video and Composite. HD Retrovision claims that their cable will work with all games. Is that really the case? And how does this apply to scenarios like Street Fighter Alpha 3 that doesn't support RGB 15 kHz? So that game also has a 480p mode, which is why HD Retrovision could say they're compatible with all the games, because technically they're right, it is. However, that specific game in RGB mode probably wouldn't work using the original disc. However, I'm pretty sure there's patches available that allow you to play that game in RGB. So if you're using an optical drive emulator, this isn't a big deal at all. If you have the original disc and you'd prefer to not use a CDR, I guess that's kind of a pain. But I'm pretty sure all games that aren't compatible with RGB have patches available to enable that. So that's how you would get around that problem with any cable, and that's how it would apply to the HD Retrovisions, because just put it in 480p mode. Of course, if you're playing on a 15 kilohertz only TV, that's an issue, but I don't think that's a problem with using CDRs or patching, though. I think that's been solved. I think the only issue that hasn't been solved are the few games that can't be forced into 480p mode and that they're going to be 480i only. And that's something that I do wish people would, I don't know if it's even possible, but if it is possible, I wish people would figure out a way to patch those, because that is kind of a pain. And, Bob deinterlacing on 480i games on a flat panel doesn't always look the best. So if there was a way to run those natively in 480p, that would be awesome. So that's the definitely a bigger issue. I think the RGB thing is just fixable with a patch. I could be remembering that wrong, but I'm pretty sure I have RGB patched versions of certain games for this exact reason. Jake Raymond said they're researching the factors into which systems receive HDMI mods. They've determined that systems that don't output anything better than S-Video and have large, enduring followings get mods, as do systems with mostly 480p libraries or libraries that could be forced into 480p. However, they noticed something. The Genesis, SNES, Jaguar, PS1, and Saturn are all systems that had most of their life cycle in the 90s, are compatible with SCART, and have mostly 240p libraries, yet of these, only the PS1 has an HDMI mod. Is it the only one of these whose library can mostly be played on an HDMI-compatible successor, which should have prevented a mod? Almost everything else about the system that might have motivated a mod could also be said about at least one of the other four systems mentioned. Since you're deep into this scene, perhaps you could elaborate on the factors that influenced the PS1 digital, while the other four systems have not been modded so far. Very fair question. While I'm not as smart as the people that design these mods, from what I've gathered, the Genesis and SNES don't generate their video in a way where you could tap digital signals. Now, there's been some progress with the SNES that still no one really knows for sure, but no matter what, at the moment, at least, in order to use those consoles, in the Saturn as well, you would have to tap their analog video outputs in order to do an internal HDMI mod, which is essentially the exact same as using an RGB cable and going to a scaler. You might get like 2% less interference because you're not using a longer cable, but it's not worth it in most scenarios. So the answer to your question is consoles that output a digital signal, or output at least their video digitally, are the ones that are on board for HDMI mods now, because people could try to tap into that signal, manipulate it the way it needs to be, and then output it to HDMI, and that's how you get some pretty incredible mods like the DC Digital, PS1 Digital, etc. Now, of course, Jaguar, I don't know if it generates video in the digital realm, and if it did, I don't know if anybody would spend the insane amount of time for such a small following, because there's a lot of people that, there's not a lot of people that would spend a lot of money for an HDMI modded Jaguar, but there are a ton of people that would spend a lot of money for an HDMI modded PS1, Genesis, or Super Nintendo. So the factors involved in all of this is, can they tap digital signals? In how is it worth it? Are you going to be able to sell enough to make it worth it? And how complicated is it once you've figured out what those digital signals are? So I know in the case of the Saturn, it may be possible, but it would be ridiculously hard, especially because of the multi-chip design and all that stuff. So it's really just comes down to, are the signals available and how hard is it to manipulate those? So while the PS2 is scheduled for an HDMI mod, and I think there's at least one other console that probably will, it's something that's going to be determined based on the original motherboard design anyway. So, I'm pretty sure you'll never see an internal Genesis HDMI mod that isn't just an analog to digital converter. And that's pretty much the limiting factor. So good question. Hopefully I explained it with enough detail so it makes sense and not too much that I bored everybody. Oliver Clare is looking for some kind of comb filter for RF consoles, and it's a pretty interesting setup. There's a bunch of RF consoles to an Ambry 15-port RF combiner, to an RF amplifier, to a composite demodulator, to a G-comp switch, which outputs both to a CRT and a FrameMeister. So there should be, but any stuff like that's going to be used on eBay, equipment that used to be really expensive, and now you could find used. I don't know of any, but I'm sure there is. Also, I'm wondering if any VCRs had comb filters built in like that. I think it might be worth looking into, but I think a decent way to do this might be taking, all of the RF consoles into whatever RF combiner you've decided to use and go into any VCR, and then have the RF output of that VCR go to the RF input of your CRT, and then have the composite video output of that VCR go into a RetroTink 2XM in pass-through mode, and then you could put that through your FrameMeister to scale it past that if you wanted to. So, maybe just for I guess I would just look at this as what's the overall easiest solution, and I would try to leverage existing hardware just to see if there's anything out there. Maybe there was a fancy VCR that had a comb filter on the RF box that could just output composite video that's already been filtered like that. I have no clue, but I think I would definitely start researching those solutions, and the one I suggested may or may not work for you as well. You could also just do depending on, because you in your list you have an RF amplifier, so maybe it's the RF combiner into the VCR, out composite into the 2XM in pass-through mode, then run an HDMI cable rather than have to worry about amplifying the signal over to where your G-comp switch is, and then use just a cheap basic HDMI to component video converter on that side. So you could take advantage of the fact that you could have a longer HDMI cable than an analog cable with less signal degradation. And that way you could continue your setup the way it's already been. So I don't know, it's an interesting one, but please let me know what you find. Well, that's it for this week. As always, thanks so much to everybody that participates in these. I really enjoy doing it. And of course, thank you to everybody that supports on Floatplane, Patreon, or right through YouTube, because it really is your support that's keeping all of these videos and all the craziness alive. So thanks very much, and I'll see you next week.